The American Civil War was fought from December 1860 to April 1865. Now, technically, fighting didn't start until April of 1861. However, most historians date it from when the first state seceded, which was South Carolina, in December. The war was fought between the Union, or the United States, and the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America. The Union's capital was Washington, D.C., and the president of the Union was Abraham Lincoln. And Union soldiers, who all received uniforms, wore navy blue. The Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, was the South. Its capital was Richmond, Virginia, and its president was Jefferson Davis, and they wore gray if they had a uniform. Generally, that was officers. Most regular soldiers wore what they owned, which was actually good for camouflage purposes. Here, we're going to look at a couple of advantages and disadvantages that each side had. So, as I stated a few minutes ago, the United States of America was the Union, and the Confederate States of America was the Confederacy. The advantages that the Union had was that they had a significantly larger population. There were about 22 million people living in the North, and this population replenished almost every day because of the steady stream of immigrants coming into the country. They had about 2.1 million men of fighting age. The South is only going to have about 700,000 men who fight throughout the entirety of the war. The U.S. or the Union also had the naval power, and this makes sense because they're the actual country here. So they had control of the actual U.S. Navy. And so they started the war with about 42 ships, and by the end of the war, they had 671. They had some very good generals, but in a minute, we'll talk about how the generals of the South were actually a little bit better. But they did have some good generals, particularly Grant and Sherman. The main thing that helped them win the war, though, was the fact that they were technologically more advanced than the South. They had better transportation and communication systems. They had probably 3 times the mileage in terms of railroad tracks that the South had. In addition to that, they had a lot of telegraph wire, which made communication very easy. Lincoln actually required them to, and when I say them, I mean Union generals, to telegraph him every time they went to a new area that had a telegraph, so that he would know exactly where they were, and he could, keep track of them on a map. He had basically a bird's eye view of where his people were, and could therefore let them know who was near them, help them plan more strategically. In addition to that, they do have a stronger government in the Union, mainly because it's an already existing government. That doesn't mean that there weren't issues within the government. Not everybody agreed on exactly everything that was being done. However, this is a government that has been in existence since 1788, and so they are, a little bit stronger. And one of the other biggest advantages, in addition to that transportation and communication systems, is the fact that the Union controlled about 95% of the factories. And these factories are going to stop making luxury items, just like in World War II, and they're going to begin making war materials. So they're going to mass produce shoes, uniforms, bullets, weapons, and then they're going to use those 22,000 miles of railroad track to get these items to the Union troops, and it's going to significantly cut the time that it would normally take. And this is a huge, huge bonus. And in the end, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is one of the main reasons the Union wins the war. So advantages for the South is that they have a determination to defend their homeland. They are on the defense here. They're going to be the ones invaded. They're the ones who are having to protect their property and their people. There were a lot of military colleges located in the South. You had two ways in the South that you could be considered upper class, and sometimes someone did both of them. But you could own a plantation, be a planter, or you could be a career military person. Both of those things were seen as honorable professions that would put you in that highest class. One of their biggest advantages, and the reason that they were winning the war for the first 2.5 years, is that they are still living the lifestyle that the people during the revolution had been living. So they are more adapted to that rough outdoor living. They know how to shoot guns. They can live off the land in terms of they know what they can eat and not eat. They have that home field advantage. They know what areas are going to flood at specific times. They know shortcuts to get places, kind of like what Francis Marion did in the American Revolution to beat the British. They also, overall, had the majority of the best military commanders, the people who had been kind of the top military commanders in the U.S. Army prior to the war are going to go to the Confederacy because many of them were Southern. And so that is another advantage they have. And they will be winning the war for the first 2.5 years until we hit Gettysburg. And when I say winning the war, I mean overall. There's going to be Union victories that are important, but overall, the North isn't gaining any ground prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. All right, the Northern strategy, of course, both sides have a strategy, and their strategy is going to be dependent upon which side they're on. The Northern strategy, they're on the offense, so their strategy is a little more involved. They want to force the South to surrender, so they're going to blockade Southern ports to cut off supplies from Europe. Both England and France, as well as some other countries, supported the Confederacy. They did not necessarily support slavery. They did, however, rely on the cotton for their factories. And so economically, they were willing to help the South to get what they needed. The second thing the Northerners wanted to do was break the Confederacy in two at the Mississippi River. The Confederate Army was smaller than the Union Army, and if they could break them in two, that would force Jefferson Davis to split the army, so you get kind of like two smaller armies, so to speak, and it would be easier to defeat them. They also wanted to destroy transportation and communication systems to break morale. Morale is the overall feeling of the troops. If morale is high, that means they're going to fight really well. If the morale is low, then they're going to kind of give up. They're not going to fight well. They're going to be easier to defeat. And so by destroying transportation, which would not only impact people, but also supplies, and then those communication systems would, leave them fighting kind of blind. And then ultimately, much like in the game Capture the Flag, the ultimate goal in a war of this time period was to attack the Confederate capital and capture it at Richmond, Virginia. Once you controlled your enemy's capital, the war was over. And you can see in this picture some examples of uniforms. You see that their regular coat is navy blue. Sometimes they do wear a lighter colored pants. Sometimes the pants match the jacket. And then this is a winter coat, which would make it easier to blend in if it's snowing, which would not be in the South, right? The Southern strategy, they're on the defensive. They are defending themselves. It's their territory. And so they have a two-pronged strategy. They want to fight a defensive war using supplies gained from Europe, which does not happen. The blockade is too strong. And then they want to break the blockade using smaller ships. And again, this is not super successful. They will get some things in and out of the blockade, but for the most part, the blockade is too strong and they don't benefit from what they're trying to do. You can see for the most part, their uniform is gray. But I do want to stress again that there was not enough money in the Confederacy for soldiers to actually have uniforms. And so your average person did not have one. They wore what they already had. But officers and then some other battalions that maybe were a little wealthier at the start of the war um, may have paid for their own uniform so that they would have one. In general, both sides thought the war would be short. They thought it would last only about 6 months to a year. In reality, it lasts almost exactly 4 years to the day. Overall, as I mentioned, the South had better generals, at least on paper, including Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And then again, they had home advantage, and that was a very big deal. And all but 2 battles were fought in the South. Gettysburg was fought in Pennsylvania, and Antietam was fought in Maryland, and they just also happened to be the 2 worst battles. This is also going to be kind of the beginning of modern warfare. And what I mean by this is, you have some significant advancements in weaponry. The Colt revolver has come out at this point, and it was a 6-shooter. You have a new type of bullet, the mini ball, which is more accurate, travels faster because it's more aerodynamic and causes more damage. And then finally, you have the Gatling gun, which is in the picture right here. And a Gatling gun is kind of like the first machine gun. It's rapid fire for their time period, and it ran on a very long clip, so it does not have to be reloaded super often. And the issue here is that the rifles that the soldiers are using still only shoot 1 bullet, so this can continuously fire on them. And, they still have to reload, and this is still firing. And it is a large caliber, so it's going to cause pretty significant damage. The head general of the Confederacy, again, was Robert E. Lee. We mentioned this at the end of the last unit. He looked great on paper, and really he was a very good general. He's from a military family. But what's going to cost him in the end is that he does not adapt to the technology. He has very good strategy. He is someone that being a general just naturally comes to. He's a good chess player, if you will, in real life. Like, he can take those same principles and apply them to battle. But ultimately, he does not make use of the technology at his disposal, particularly with the telegraph. And he just doesn't have the industry to help him. The 2 main generals that we'll talk about in this unit are Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. Grant is the most successful of the head Union generals. There were a long series of them throughout the war. He does not look like he would be good on paper. He graduated 21 of 39 in his class from the Army Academy. However, he did adapt to the technology, and he was willing to fight the way that needed to be fought, which is called total war, and we'll talk about that later. But he's willing to do whatever he needs to win, and Lee was not willing to do that, and that's another reason that makes him not super successful. And then we'll talk about Sherman. He is known for his march to the sea, and then he comes up South Carolina, going into North Carolina, and basically burns or destroys everything in his path, as also part of total war. So some specific strategies employed by both sides. So the North used a blockade, which was codenamed the Anaconda Plan. An anaconda is a constrictor snake, so it squeezes the life out of its prey. And that was the goal of this blockade. It was to squeeze the life out of the South. Very successful. And if the Southerners hadn't been so good at living off the land, they probably wouldn't have lasted as long under this blockade. But they did blockade about 3,500 miles of coastline, as well as portions of the Mississippi River. And this blockade was run out of South Carolina. So the headquarters was just off of Beaufort, which is down here, almost the last place you go to in South Carolina before you get to Georgia. A strategy for the South, they wanted to break the blockade. And so they tried smaller ships called blockade runners, and then they came up with the idea to build a submarine. And so they're going to build this submarine out of a ship's boiler. So if you think of the Titanic, it has a smokestack, or four smokestacks actually. The boiler is the part of the smokestack that is below the ship decks. And this is where you would normally put the coal in to make the ship go. They're going to take one of those and they're going to turn it into a submarine. And again, the goal is to break the blockade. They successfully sink an enemy ship, which is amazing. They're the first submarine to do that. But in the process, they sink themselves. And this is because they don't have a good working knowledge of physics. And so when they use an underwater explosion on the ship, it creates a wave that comes back and engulfs the Hunley. And this is not a fully submersible submarine. So it's going to be engulfed and it's basically going to sink and everyone inside is going to perish. So again, on the positive side, it does sink an enemy ship. And this idea is going to be improved upon so that by the time of World War I, there are actual operational submarines, fully submersible. On the downside, though, because they didn't have a good enough working knowledge of physics and what was going to happen, it sinks itself in the process. And so they do not break the blockade, and they actually did not find the Hunley until 1995. But it leads to bigger and better things.